The moment Clara Whitfield walked into the Dusty Boot Saloon that October morning, every conversation died. It wasn't that she was dressed fine, she wasn't. Her calico dress had been washed so many times the pattern had faded to a suggestion of color, and the hem was frayed at the bottom where she'd let it down to save buying new fabric. It wasn't that she was loud or brash or carrying trouble on her face. It was the opposite. She was young, 26, maybe 27, and she walked in with a stillness that didn't belong in a saloon, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from having already made a decision that cost everything. She was holding the hand of a little boy, maybe 4 years old, who pressed himself against her leg and stared at the floor with enormous brown eyes. Nobody moved. The piano player let his hands drift off the keys. Hector Dane was sitting at the far table near the window when she walked in. He'd been sitting at that same table for the better part of 3 years, nursing whatever they poured and watching Cutter Creek go about its business without him. He was 51 years old, weathered down to something lean and quiet. A man who looked like the land had tried to reclaim him and hadn't quite finished. He'd been a lawman once, a sheriff over in Colby County, until the day everything went wrong in a way that couldn't be unmade. Now he was just a man who drank slowly and bothered nobody. He watched Clara Whitfield walk to the bar. She didn't look around at the staring men. She looked straight at Roy Tanner behind the counter, the saloon keeper, a broad man with a red beard who shifted his weight the way men do when something makes them uncomfortable but they're too polite to say so. "Mr. Tanner," she said. Her voice was clear. It did not shake. "I'm looking for work, cleaning, cooking, washing glasses, whatever needs doing. I can start today." Roy glanced down at the boy and then back at her. The whole room was still listening. A woman like Clara Whitfield, a schoolteacher's widow, as Hector would later learn, asking for saloon work in a town like Cutter Creek, was the kind of thing that got talked about for months. It wasn't cruelty that made men stare. It was the shock of watching someone's dignity and desperation occupy the same body at the same time. "Clara," Roy said carefully, "I don't think I'll take the job." It came out of Hector Dane's mouth before his brain had cleared the idea. He said it from across the room, still seated, and every head in the saloon swiveled toward him like a weather vane in a crosswind. He didn't know why he said it. Later, when he tried to explain it to himself, he couldn't find anything simpler than this. She had walked in carrying a 4-year-old child and hadn't once let her chin drop. Something about that particular kind of courage undid him. Clara turned and looked at him. Her eyes were gray and sharp, the eyes of someone who had learned to read people quickly because the wrong read cost too much. "I don't know you," she said. "Hector Dane." He stood up slowly, because his knee hadn't been right since a horse rolled on it in '78. "I've got a property north of town. The old alderman spread. Bought it 2 years back with the notion of doing something with it and haven't managed to do much of anything." He walked toward her, keeping his hands visible, keeping his pace easy. "The main house needs work. The root cellar is flooding every time it rains. I've got fence lines down across the north pasture and no idea where to start." He stopped at a respectful distance and looked at her directly. "I need someone who can manage a house and tell me what's broken in a way I can actually hear. I'll pay fair wages, meals included. For both of you." The boy looked up at him for the first time. Hector looked back at him and nodded once, man to man, the way you do with small people who are taking the measure of you. Clara studied Hector the way she might study a contract she was being asked to sign without enough time to read it. "I don't need saving, Mr. Dane," she said quietly. "I need work." "Good," Hector said, "because I'm offering work, not saving. Those are different things." She considered him for another long moment. Then she looked down at the boy Thomas. She would tell him later. Thomas was 4.5 and had not slept through the night in 3 weeks, and something in her face settled. Not surrender, but calculation. The kind of calculation a woman makes when she has run out of options and has to choose between the one that's humiliating and the one that's merely uncertain. "When do I start?" she said. "Now, if you like," said Hector Dane. "There's a pot of coffee on the stove that I made this morning and it's probably terrible." The first thing Clara told him on the walk out to the alderman spread, with Thomas riding on her hip because his legs had given out somewhere around the edge of town, was that she was not there to be pitied and she was not there to be courted, and she was not there to be anybody's notion of a charity case. She said it plainly, without heat, as a matter of fact. Hector said he understood. The second thing she told him was that her husband, Edward Whitfield, had been the school teacher in Cutter Creek for 6 years and had died 14 months ago of typhoid, along with 11 other people in the valley, in a summer that Hector remembered as the worst the county had seen. Edward had been 29 years old. He had been, Clara said, a genuinely good man, which she understood was not something everyone could say about their husbands. Hector said nothing to that. There wasn't much to say. What Clara did not tell him yet, what she would not tell him for another 2 weeks, was about Silas Pryor. Silas Pryor was the man who owned the building where the schoolhouse sat, the building where Edward had taught, the building that also happened to contain the 2 rooms where Clara and Thomas had been living since Edward's death. The school board had allowed it, a courtesy to the widow of their beloved teacher. But Silas Pryor had not allowed it out of courtesy. He had allowed it because he was the kind of man who kept track of what he was owed. In the weeks after Edward died, Pryor had come to see Clara 3 times. Each time, he brought documents. Each time, he spoke in the tone of a man performing generosity while actually performing arithmetic. Edward, it turned out, had borrowed $400 from Pryor 2 years earlier to fund the school's library books, maps, a globe that Thomas still liked to spin. The loan had been informal, handshake style, the kind that a trusting man makes with a neighbor. But Pryor had written it down, because Pryor always wrote things down, and the note had a clause that Clara could not find any way around, no matter how many times she read it. If the borrower died, the full amount was due within 18 months of the date of death. Edward had died in August. 18 months meant February. Clara had 4 months. She had $43. She had sold everything sellable: the second horse, Edward's good saddle, the silver tea service that had been her mother's. She had taken in mending until her fingers bled. She had given 3 months of piano lessons to the banker's daughters. She had done everything a woman could do quietly and alone, and it had gotten her to $43. Then she had walked into the Dusty Boot Saloon and asked Roy Tanner for work, because there was nowhere left to turn that she hadn't already turned. When Hector found out about Pryor, not from Clara but from Roy Tanner, who told him quietly over a glass one evening, about a week into Clara's employment, he sat with the information for 2 days before he did anything with it. He thought about Silas Pryor, whom he knew only slightly and didn't like much. Pryor was not a dramatic villain. He didn't twirl a mustache or make threats in public. He was simply a man who understood that money was a form of power, and that power, exercised patiently, could take almost anything it wanted from people who had less of it. He'd done the same thing to the Hendersons over on Mill Road 3 years back. Bought their debt from the bank, waited until they were 6 weeks from paying it off, and then exercised some clause nobody had read carefully enough to claim the equipment they'd used the debt to buy. Legal, documented, perfectly awful. Hector knew the type. He'd dealt with the type from the other side of a sheriff's badge for 19 years. You couldn't arrest a man for knowing how contracts worked. He also knew what Clara would say if he brought it up wrong. So he waited until the evening of the 9th day, when Thomas had fallen asleep by the fire with his shoes still on, and Clara was sitting at the kitchen table going over figures in a small notebook with a look on her face that he recognized. It was the look of a person doing math that doesn't add up, running the same numbers again and again, hoping the answer will change. "I know about the note," Hector said. She didn't startle. She closed the notebook slowly, which told him she'd been expecting the conversation. "Roy Tanner talks too much," she said. "He does. He means well. Most people who ruin things mean well." She looked at the closed notebook instead of at him. "I'm handling it. How much have you got?" A pause. $46. "I've been here 9 days and you've been generous with wages, but $400 in 4 months, Hector said. "I know the math, Mr. Dane. I've been doing the same math." She looked up at him then. Her gray eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The tiredness of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and can feel their arms beginning to fail. "I'm not going to ask you for money," she said. It wasn't pride exactly. It was something more considered than pride. It was a principle. "I have a son." I have to be someone my son can respect when he's old enough to understand what his mother did to survive. Accepting charity from a man I've known 9 days is not that. I'm not offering charity, Hector said. I'm offering a deal. She waited. He told her what he'd been turning over for the past 2 days. The alderman's spread had good bones, 40 acres of decent land, a well that had never gone dry in any drought on record, a barn that needed a new roof but otherwise sound, and grazing land that hadn't been properly worked in 6 years. He'd bought it cheap because the previous owner had let it go to ruin and nobody in the county thought it was worth much. But Hector had grown up on a ranch before everything else happened, and he knew the difference between land that was ruined and land that was resting. I've got some money put away, he said. Not much. Enough. I've been sitting on it for 3 years because I couldn't figure out what the point was. He looked at his hands, both of them carrying the kind of scars that came from years of work and one catastrophic night that had ended his career in law. I'd like to put it to use. But I can't run a ranch alone, and I don't trust hired men enough to bring them onto land. I'm trying to build something on. I'd need a partner. A partner, Clara repeated carefully. Someone who can manage accounts, who knows how to work, who has a reason to care about whether it succeeds. He looked at her directly. 50-50. The debt to Pryor gets paid from my savings as a business investment. The ranch turns a profit, we split it. If it doesn't, you're no worse off than you are now. The silence that followed was long enough that the fire popped twice. Why? Clara said finally. You could hire a hand for 1/4 of what this would cost you. You don't need a partner. You need help. Hector was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was picking up, pushing cold air down from the north the way it did in October when the real winter was making its intentions clear. I spent 19 years being a lawman, he said. I was good at it. And then one night in Colby County, I made a decision in about 4 seconds that I've spent the last 3 years trying to figure out if it was the right one. He paused. A man was killed. A man I was trying to protect. I got the people who did it, but he was still dead, and his family was still destroyed. And none of my being right about the law helped him one bit. He looked at his scarred hands again. I came to Cutter Creek to stop thinking about it. And I've discovered that not thinking about things you're supposed to think about is its own kind of dying. Clara was watching him now with the full attention she usually reserved for conversations she was going to have to remember exactly. I don't want to save you, Hector said. I want to build something. I think you do too. I think you're someone worth building alongside. And I think Thomas deserves to grow up somewhere that isn't the corner room of a schoolhouse that a man named Pryor owns. Another long silence. I need to think about it, Clara said. Take your time. I'll tell you in the morning, she said, which was not taking her time at all, but which was the answer of someone who had already done most of the thinking and just needed the night to be certain. She said yes before breakfast. They rode into town together the following week and found Silas Pryor at his usual table in the back of the land office, a small man with very precise clothing and the careful eyes of someone who spent his life looking for the weakness in a room. He greeted Clara with the particular warmth of a man who holds a note and knows it. He greeted Hector with polite caution, because Pryor was smart enough to recognize that an ex-sheriff with a reputation for stubbornness and nothing left to lose was a different kind of problem than a widowed schoolteacher. We're here about the Whitfield note, Hector said. It's a private financial matter, Pryor said pleasantly. Mrs. Whitfield asked me to accompany her as a business associate, Hector said. She has a proposal. Pryor folded his hands on the desk. I'm listening. Clara placed a piece of paper in front of him. She had spent 2 evenings writing it out. It laid out the terms of a proposed early repayment, not the full 400, but a structured payment that would eliminate half the principal within 60 days and the remainder within 6 months. In exchange, she was requesting that Pryor formally rescind the 18-month clause, replacing it with a rolling agreement that acknowledged the debt without the deadline as weapon. Pryor read it with the leisurely pace of a man who already knows what he's going to say. This is not the arrangement we made, he said. The arrangement you made was with my husband, Clara said. My husband is dead. You are now doing business with me, and I am proposing different terms. The note doesn't allow for renegotiation. The note, Hector said, was written on a piece of notepaper with no witnesses and no legal notarization. He had looked into this quietly, through a lawyer friend in Colby County he'd written to 2 weeks earlier. In the state of Texas, an informal promissory note of this kind is valid but subject to challenge, particularly when the original borrower is deceased and the inheriting party was not a signatory. Pryor's eyes went a degree cooler. "You're not a lawyer, Mr. Dane." "No," Hector agreed, "but I know one. And so does Judge Harley over in the county seat, who I had occasion to write to recently on a related matter. He finds the clause particularly interesting." This was true enough. The judge had found it interesting in the way a man finds something interesting when he's deciding whether to look into it further. Hector had not exactly waited to find out what the judge would decide, but Pryor didn't need to know that. The silence in the land office had a different quality now. Pryor looked at Clara, then at Hector, then back at the paper. 60 days for the first payment, he said. 60 days, Clara confirmed. "And I want a formal accounting of the partnership agreement before I sign anything." "You'll have it by the end of the week," Hector said. They left Pryor's office and walked out into the cold October sunlight without looking at each other. Thomas, who had been waiting outside with Mrs. Garvey from the millinery shop next door, ran to Clara immediately and grabbed her hand. She picked him up and held him tight, and over his shoulder, her eyes closed for just a moment. And Hector understood that this was what relief looked like when you had been keeping yourself from feeling it for months. He didn't say anything. He just walked beside her toward the livery where their horses were tied, because some moments don't need commentary. The work that followed was the hardest kind, the kind that doesn't look dramatic from the outside but costs everything from the inside. They fixed the barn roof first, because the barn was what they needed before they could buy stock. Hector worked from one side and Clara from the other, passing boards and nails in a system they worked out without discussing it, reading each other's rhythm the way people do when they've started to understand how the other person thinks. Thomas sat below them in the hay, solemnly handing tools up when they were needed, and occasionally offering unsolicited opinions on how the work was going. The first cattle they bought were 8 head, scrub stock that nobody else wanted, bought cheap from a rancher over in Marvell County who was liquidating. They weren't much to look at, but Clara had grown up on a farm before she married Edward and became a teacher's wife, and she knew what she was looking at when she looked at cattle. She saw that 3 of the 8 were heifers that could be bred, and she knew that 3 heifers, properly managed over 2 years, were the beginning of something real. Hector watched her negotiate the purchase and felt, for the first time in years, the specific pleasure of being around someone who was genuinely good at something. November came cold and uncompromising. They were up before dawn most days, working until the light was gone, falling into exhausted silence over meals that Clara cooked on the small iron stove while Hector did the evening rounds and checked the stock. Thomas began sleeping through the night. Finally, curled under 2 quilts with a stray cat that had adopted him with no input from anyone. On the 1st of December, Clara brought in $31 from selling her mending work and what she'd saved from her wages. Hector matched it with the first draw from his savings. They rode to Pryor's office together and placed $62 on his desk, not the full amount he'd wanted, but a real payment, documented, witnessed by Roy Tanner, who came along for that exact purpose. Pryor counted it twice. $138 remains, he said. "We know," said Clara. What she didn't say, and what Hector didn't say, was that they were short. Not catastrophically short, not yet, but short enough that the math for the next payment was uncomfortable. The cattle had cost more than they'd planned. A section of fence line had turned out to need complete replacement rather than repair, and the lumber cost had been brutal. They had 4 months and $112 between them, and 4 months was not enough time for cattle to do what cattle needed to do. It was Roy Tanner who came to them unexpectedly on a Thursday evening in January. He sat down at the kitchen table of the alderman. Spread the table was different now. The kitchen was different now. There were curtains on the windows that Clara had made from a bolt of cloth she'd traded mending work to receive, and he put a piece of paper on the table between them. On it were names, 22 of them. People from Cutter Creek and the surrounding ranches and farms. "What's this?" Hector asked. "People who knew Edward Whitfield," Roy said simply. "People who know what Pryor's been doing for the last 10 years with folks who can't fight back." The Hendersons signed. The widow Markham signed. Even old Pastor Davies signed. And he doesn't sign anything. Clara stared at the paper. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "No," Roy agreed. "That's why they did it." He tapped the paper. 22 people. Some of them put in $2. Some put in $5. Some put in $10. It comes to $89. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, wind moved through the bare cottonwood trees, the kind of sound that winter makes when it's not trying to be anything but what it is. Clara pressed her lips together in a way that Hector had come to understand meant she was fighting something internal that she didn't want witnessed. "I'll pay it back," she said. "Every last person on that list told me to tell you," Roy said, "that they are not interested in being paid back. They are interested in Silas Pryor losing." That made a sound come out of Clara that was halfway between a laugh and something else, and she put her hand over her mouth and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Thomas wandered in from the other room and looked at the three adults at the table and correctly identified that something important was happening. He climbed into Clara's lap without asking, which was his way, and she put her arms around him automatically. Hector looked at the paper with 22 names on it and felt the specific weight of the thing, the fact that a town, which could have watched a woman fall and simply narrated her falling, had instead chosen to catch her. It was not a small thing. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know that communities were capable of terrible indifference. He had also been in law enforcement long enough to know that, occasionally, unpredictably, they were capable of this. 3 weeks later, on a morning so cold, the water in the horse trough had a skin of ice across the top, Clara Whitfield walked into Silas Pryor's land office for the last time. She was alone. She had insisted on that. She placed a banker's draft on his desk for $138 and watched him pick it up. Pryor's face, when he understood what he was holding, was not dramatic. It didn't crumble or contort. It simply went still in the way of a man who had been certain of something and has discovered he was wrong. He looked at the draft. He looked at Clara. He looked at the draft again. He signed the release without saying a word. Clara walked out of the land office into the white January light, and Hector was standing across the street with Thomas on his shoulders, because Thomas had demanded to come and demanded to be carried, and Hector had not been able to find a good argument against either of these positions. She crossed the street and stopped in front of them. "Done?" Hector asked. "Done," Clara said. Thomas, from his height on Hector's shoulders, patted Hector on the top of the head with the benevolent confidence of a boy who has decided something. "Can we get pie?" Thomas asked. "Yes," said both adults at the same time. They were married in the spring, in the small church at the edge of Cutter Creek, on a morning when the cottonwoods were just beginning to leaf out, and the land had that particular green smell of something being renewed. The whole town came, or close enough to it. Roy Tanner stood up front with a handkerchief he pretended he wasn't using. Mrs. Garvey from the millinery brought a cake that was unreasonably large for the occasion, and unapologetically so. The 22 people from Roy's list were all there, ranchers and farmers and shopkeepers, and the widow Markham, who cried through the entire ceremony and didn't try to hide it. Thomas stood next to Clara in a shirt that had been pressed within an inch of its life, and held her hand with the seriousness of someone fulfilling an important responsibility. The first years were not easy. Nothing about building something real ever is. The debt from Hector's savings would take time to recover. The 8 cattle became 20, then 40. Slowly, the way honest work accumulates, not in dramatic leaps, but in the steady addition of one right decision after another. Clara managed the accounts and the household and the negotiations with buyers, which she was better at than Hector, by a margin that neither of them pretended otherwise. Hector managed the land and the stock and the physical labor that the ranch demanded, which he could still do with his bad knee if he started slowly in the mornings and didn't push past what his body told him. 2 winters after the wedding, when a blizzard came down from the north and held them snowbound for 11 days, they ran out of coffee on day 4 and discovered that this was a genuine test of character. They passed it, barely. Thomas thought the whole thing was an adventure and built increasingly elaborate snow constructions near the barn, critiquing them severely and starting again. By the time Thomas was 10 years old and starting to take an interest in how the ranch worked, the alderman spread they had quietly renamed it, not making a ceremony of it, but simply starting to call it differently in conversation, had 60 head, and was turning a profit steady enough that they had begun to think about expansion. Not dramatically. Not the way ambitious men think about expansion, with hunger and risk. The way people who have been genuinely poor think about it, with caution and gratitude, and the specific humility of knowing how fast things can go wrong. Hector was in his early 60s by then, slower but still present, still walking the fence lines in the mornings, still watching the sky the way a man does who has learned to read it. The bad knee was worse. His back had opinions, but the land was his in a way that nothing had been since before Colby County, and that mattered to him in a way he couldn't fully explain, except to say that it was the difference between occupying a place and belonging to one. Clara, at 36, was not the woman who had walked into the Dusty Boot Saloon with a faded calico dress and trembling hands. She was something older and less breakable. She had laugh lines and calluses and an ability to read a cattle auction that made buyers underestimate her exactly once. She was also the woman who, 3 years after their marriage, had organized the first public school lending library in the county in Edward's memory, which was a thing that would have made Edward Whitfield laugh with surprised delight, because Clara had never once in their marriage been interested in libraries. "You would have hated this project," she told him sometimes, quietly, when she visited the small grave marker in the churchyard with Thomas. "You would have loved watching it succeed." Thomas grew into a boy who was precise about machinery and stubborn about fairness, and deeply attached to the stray cat, which had against all actuarial probability lived to be quite old and was still sleeping in his bed. People asked Hector sometimes what he'd been thinking that morning in the Dusty Boot, why he'd stepped in when he could have looked at his whiskey glass and let Clara Whitfield face Roy Tanner's uncomfortable silence alone. He never had a satisfying answer. The honest version was something like this. He had spent 3 years making himself smaller, taking up less space, thinking less, feeling less, requiring less. He had been quite good at it, and then a young woman with a faded dress and a small boy in a chin held at exactly the right angle had walked into a saloon, and something in him that he had assumed was gone had simply refused to stay quiet. He hadn't known her. He hadn't known her worth or her intelligence or the specific way she would sit at the kitchen table in the blue morning light, running figures in a notebook, working the problem again, even when the problem looked unsolvable. He hadn't known that she would teach him things about land and patience that he hadn't known a person could teach another person. He hadn't known that Thomas would grow up to be someone who asked the exact right questions about everything, and was, in Hector's entirely unbiased opinion, one of the finest small people he had ever encountered. He had known only one thing in that moment, and it was a simple thing. She was not going to ask for help again. Whatever she had cost herself to walk into that saloon and ask Roy Tanner for work, she had paid it, and she was not going to pay it again. The window was open for about 30 seconds and then it would close, and she would carry whatever she was carrying alone until it either broke her or didn't. Hector had spent 19 years as a lawman watching that window close on people, watching the exact moment when someone who needed help stopped asking for it and decided to stop needing it, which was not the same thing. He had made mistakes he couldn't unmake. In a dusty street in Colby County, 4 seconds of decision that had been right by the law and wrong by his heart. He had thought, sitting at that table with his bad knee and his slow whiskey and his 3 years of making himself smaller, that he was done making decisions that cost something. He had been wrong about that. And late at night now, when the wind moves through the cottonwoods and Clara is asleep and the ranch is quiet and Thomas's light has gone out across the yard, Hector Dane thinks about the man he was in that corner table, the ghost of a lawman, drinking slowly, taking up as little space as possible, waiting for time to pass. He thinks about how close it came to staying that way, and then he listens to the sound of the land that is his, and the house that is theirs, and the life that was built out of something that looked, on an October morning in Cutter Creek, like nothing more than one woman's last attempt and one man's unplanned answer. And he understands, in the way that you only understand things that cost you something real, that she had not needed saving. She had needed a door. He had just been standing near one. Sometimes the help we need doesn't arrive as a rescue, it arrives as someone simply refusing to look away. Clara didn't need a savior. She needed one person willing to stand beside her long enough for her own strength to do its work. And Hector didn't need a purpose handed to him. He needed a reason to stop shrinking. When you offer someone a door, you often find it leads somewhere you needed to go too. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of warmth and entertainment while carrying a small, sincere lesson about courage, community, and the quiet power of showing up for one another.